Hands slammed against the hood of a police car. Cold steel cuffs bite into his wrists. A low chuckle fills the air as the officer leans in close. You're done. No way out of this one. But what they don't know, the man they just arrested is the state's chief prosecutor. And in his hands, he holds the evidence that could bring down an entire network of corrupt cops. Will justice prevail, or will the system bury him before the truth gets out? If you've ever felt the weight of injustice, if you believe no one should be above the law, drop a comment below. Justice must be served. And don't forget to follow, because this story will take you on a ride you won't forget. The night was thick with silence, the kind that pressed against the skin, heavy and unnatural. The city had long since settled into its usual rhythm, faint sirens in the distance, the occasional hum of a passing car. But something about tonight felt different. Ethan Carter pulled his coat tighter around him, his grip firm on the worn leather handle of his briefcase. Inside, neatly stacked and organized, were pages of evidence, names, dates, transactions. Everything he needed to expose the rot within the police force. Everything that could bring them down. But only if he made it to the meeting. His shoes tapped lightly against the pavement, the sound bouncing off the empty buildings lining the street. Just a few more blocks. He could already picture the diner ahead, dimly lit and long abandoned, a perfect place for a meeting that wasn't meant to be seen. Then, a flicker in the glass of a storefront. A shadow? A figure shifting in the reflection? Ethan slowed, glancing over his shoulder. The street was empty, but the feeling gnawed at him, an itch at the back of his mind. Then came the lights. Red and blue flashed against the buildings, pulsing like a heartbeat. A low hum filled the air as a police cruiser rolled up beside him, tires grinding against the asphalt. Ethan exhaled slowly. Running wasn't an option. The car door creaked open, and two officers stepped out. The first was built like a bulldozer, solid, broad, radiating power with every step. Jake Barnes. Ethan recognized him immediately. He'd seen the name before, in reports of excessive force complaints buried under paperwork, brushed aside. The kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice to make his authority known. Behind him, Lucas Grant followed, younger, hesitant, his eyes darting between Barnes and Ethan like he wasn't sure which side he belonged to. Barnes smirked as he approached, hands resting casually on his belt. Late night for a stroll, Mr. Carter. Ethan kept his expression neutral. I wasn't aware walking was a crime. Barnes let out a chuckle, low and knowing. Ordinarily, it's not. He gestured vaguely. Problem is, we just got a report of a burglary. And wouldn't you know it, you fit the description. Ethan raised a brow. A well-dressed black man with a briefcase? That's your suspect? Barnes shrugged. Gotta follow the leads. His gaze dropped to the briefcase. And what's in there? Ethan tightened his grip. Legal documents. Barnes clicked his tongue, pretending to consider it. That right? He extended a hand. Then you won't mind if we take a look. Ethan didn't move. Not without a warrant. For a beat, no one spoke. Then, without warning, Barnes reached forward and ripped the briefcase from his grasp. Ethan stepped forward. That's unlawful search and seizure. Barnes flipped the latch, casually thumbing through the papers, eyes skimming the damning evidence inside. And then he smiled. Well, he snapped the briefcase shut, tucking it under his arm like it was his own. Looks like someone's been working overtime. Ethan's pulse pounded. You're making a mistake, Barnes chuckled. Oh, I don't think so. And then, before Ethan could react, a hand slammed against his shoulder, yanking him backward. His arms were wrenched behind him, the cold bite of steel tightening around his wrists. His breath hitched. Ethan Carter, Barnes drawled, you're under arrest for suspicion of burglary and resisting arrest. Ethan clenched his jaw. You have no evidence. Barnes leaned in, his breath warm against Ethan's ear, voice low and deliberate. I don't need evidence, he murmured. I have power. The door of the cruiser swung open. A rough shove sent Ethan stumbling forward, landing hard against the seat. Through the window, he caught Grant's expression, troubled, uncertain. But Grant said nothing. The door slammed shut. The locks clicked. As the car pulled away from the curb, Ethan's hands curled into fists. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a warning. And if he didn't fight back, they wouldn't stop. The station air was different. Stagnant. Heavy. It clung to Ethan's skin the moment he was pulled from the cruiser, the sharp night air replaced by something colder, something lifeless. The hum of the city was gone, swallowed by these walls, leaving only the sterile hum of fluorescent lights overhead, flickering like dying stars. They moved him without a word. Barnes walked ahead, his posture loose, unbothered, like a man who had already won. Grant followed, silent, his steps too light for a man wearing a badge. Ethan's own movements felt heavier, like gravity itself had shifted against him. At the booking desk, a uniformed officer barely looked up. No curiosity, no questions. Just another night. Rough hands tore at his coat, fingers stripping him of his belt, his watch, his wallet. The cold air slapped against his wrists as his sleeves were shoved up. His pockets emptied onto a metal tray, phone, keys, everything that tethered him to the world outside. Gone in seconds. A clipboard slid across the counter. The officer, middle-aged, indifferent, didn't even glance at Ethan. Charges? Barnes smirked, rolling his shoulders like he had all the time in the world. Burglary. Resisting arrest. No hesitation. No verification. Just the scratch of a pen against paper. Ethan breathed in through his nose. Slow, steady. He knew this game. He had spent years tearing men like Barnes apart in court, stripping them down with facts, unraveling their power. But here there were no rules, only the ones they created. The cuffs came off with a metallic snap, leaving the skin beneath raw. Ethan flexed his fingers, barely feeling them. But before he could fully process the relief, Barnes clamped a hand around his arm and yanked him forward. "Enjoy your stay," he murmured, his breath warm against Ethan's ear. The door to the holding cell groaned open. Ethan stepped inside. The space was smaller than he expected, bare concrete, a single metal bench bolted to the wall, a toilet shoved into the corner. No windows, no clock, just four walls pressing inward, trapping the air, suffocating it. The door slammed shut behind him with a weight that settled deep in his chest. Silence. No distant sirens, no street noise. Only the hum of the lights and the occasional shuffle of boots beyond the bars. He let out a slow breath, watching it hang in the chilled air. No one knew he was here. No call had been made. No records had been entered. He was off the grid. He was a ghost. And ghosts don't leave footprints. Ethan sat still, his back straight against the cold metal bench, hands resting lightly on his knees. The air in the cell was stagnant, pressing in from all sides, thick with the scent of disinfectant, and something older. Something forgotten. The world outside might as well have been 1,000 miles away. Then, a presence. He lifted his head. Lucas Grant stood just beyond the bars, half hidden in the dim light, his posture tense, his fingers twitching at his sides. He wasn't supposed to linger. Ethan could tell by the way his eyes darted toward the hallway, by the way his weight shifted like he was debating whether to stay or go. But he didn't move. That hesitation, it meant something. Ethan studied him, watching the slight, nervous movements, the way his breathing shallowed, the way his fingers curled near his belt, not in confidence but in uncertainty. Grant knew. Not everything, but enough. Enough to make him pause, enough to make him doubt. Ethan leaned forward, slow, deliberate, elbows resting on his knees. His voice was quiet when he spoke, the kind of quiet that sliced through the silence like a knife. "You can walk away from this," he said, his eyes locked onto Grant's. "Tonight, tomorrow, maybe for years." Grant swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing, but he didn't look away. "But one day," Ethan continued, steady, controlled, "you're going to hear my name again. Maybe on the news, maybe in a courtroom. And when you do," he let the words hang in the air, let them settle deep, "you'll remember this moment." Grant exhaled through his nose, a quiet, shaky breath. Ethan leaned in just a little more, his voice dropping lower. "You can stay silent now." A pause. Then, "But can you live with that for the rest of your life?" The hum of the fluorescent lights stretched the silence between them. Grant's fingers curled into fists. His shoulders tensed. For the briefest moment, his lips parted, like he might say something, like he might break. Then, footsteps. Distant, but approaching. Grant stiffened. His gaze flickered to the hallway, then back to Ethan, something unreadable flashing across his face. Then he stepped back, not a word. Not yet. But he didn't leave right away. For now, that was enough. The phone felt cold against Ethan's palm, heavier than it should have been. His one call, his only chance. The officer behind the desk didn't even glance up. "Make it count." Ethan inhaled slowly, steadying himself as he punched in the number. The line rang once, twice. The silence between each ring stretched longer than it should have, tension coiling in his chest. Then, Samantha Reed. Sharp, direct. The way she always answered unknown calls, ready for business, ready for anything. Ethan closed his eyes for half a second, just long enough to feel the relief settle in his chest before he spoke. "It's me." A pause. Not hesitation. Calculation. Then, movement. A chair scraping back. The rustle of papers being shoved aside. "Where the hell are you?" Not a question, a demand. Woodcrest Station, holding cell. Silence, but not empty. Something shifting. Clicks of understanding falling into place. "You didn't show up." Her voice was quieter now, sharper. "I waited. I knew something was wrong." Ethan exhaled. Of course she knew. Samantha Reed didn't miss things. That's why she was his right hand, because she was always 2 steps ahead. And right now, he needed her to be. She didn't waste time asking what happened. She knew he wouldn't call unless it was bad. Instead, "Tell me everything." Ethan laid it out, what little there was. The stop, Barnes, the false charges, the missing evidence. By the time he finished, she was already moving. He could hear it. The soft click of a keyboard, the shuffle of files, the scratch of a pen against paper. "How long do I have?" she asked. He glanced at the officer by the desk, barely paying attention, tapping his pen against the clipboard. "Not long." A beat of silence. Then, Samantha's voice, steady, certain. "Hold tight." No hesitation, no doubt, just 2 words, a promise. The line went dead. And for the first time since that cell door slammed shut, Ethan allowed himself to breathe. Samantha didn't waste a second. The moment the call ended, she was already moving, one hand grabbing her laptop, the other flipping through the files she'd been reviewing before Ethan disappeared. She had spent years working beside him, anticipating his next move, thinking 2 steps ahead. But this wasn't part of the plan. She set her laptop on the desk, fingers flying across the keyboard. First step. Track him. His phone was dark, off the grid, no pings, no signals. That meant one thing. They didn't want him to be found. But there were other ways. She pulled up traffic camera footage from the last known location he had sent her. It took a few minutes she didn't have, but then there it was. The screen flickered, and the footage played. A quiet street. Ethan walking alone. Then the glow of headlights, flashing red and blue. She watched as the patrol car pulled up as 2 officers stepped out. Barnes, Grant. Her jaw tightened. She slowed the playback. Ethan didn't resist, didn't fight, he barely even moved. And yet, Barnes still shoved him, still grabbed him like he was guilty of something. Samantha clipped the footage, saved it. Then she dug deeper. The city's automated scanner logs. If this was a routine stop, there should have been a record. Barnes and Grant running his plates, confirming the suspect description. There was nothing, which meant they weren't looking for a suspect. They were looking for Ethan. Her pulse ticked higher. They thought they could erase him, thought no one would notice. They were about to find out how wrong they were. She picked up her phone and dialed, not Ethan. Someone else. Someone who could make noise. By dawn, the story had spread. The footage had gone viral. Major networks picked it up. State prosecutor detained without cause. Unlawful arrest sparks outrage. News anchors debated it on morning shows. Social media erupted with hashtags calling for justice. The footage played on repeat, frame by frame in slow motion, over and over. Calls flooded the Woodcrest Station. Protesters gathered outside, and inside, panic. By mid-morning, the order came down. Let him go. Ethan heard the keys before he saw the guard. The metal door swung open. He stepped forward, shaking off the stiffness in his limbs. No Barnes. Of course not. Cowards don't show up when they lose. At the desk, his belongings were dumped unceremoniously into a plastic tray. Wallet, watch, phone finally turned back on, vibrating with unread messages. The moment he stepped outside, cameras turned toward him. Microphones lifted, questions fired from every direction. But Ethan didn't stop. They had let him go. But now it was time to fight back. The air inside the courtroom was thick, not just with expectation, but with something deeper. Heavier. The kind of weight that pressed against the walls filled the space between each breath, tightening around those who thought this was just another case. Ethan Carter sat at the defense table. But he was not the accused, he was his own counsel. He had spent years in rooms like this, arguing cases, dismantling lies, exposing corruption piece by piece. But this time it was personal. Across the room, Officer Barnes sat with the easy arrogance of a man who had played this game before. His uniform was crisp, his smirk barely contained. To his right, District Attorney Patricia Reynolds adjusted her papers. Calm, calculated, a woman who didn't lose because she didn't take risks. To them, this was already decided. Barnes had the system behind him, years of influence, connections, power that never wavered. Reynolds had the law, the jury, the carefully crafted narrative. And Ethan had the truth. The gavel struck, the judge entered. A hush fell over the gallery, the low murmur of anticipation dissolving into silence. Reynolds rose first, smoothing her suit as she approached the jury. Her tone was polished, confident, the voice of someone who had built a case brick by brick, certain it would hold. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "this case is about facts, about the law, and about ensuring that no one, no matter how powerful, no matter how well connected, is above it." She let that statement settle, then turned slightly, her gaze flicking toward Ethan before continuing. The defendant, Misstep Carter, was lawfully detained under suspicion of a crime. The officers on duty that night followed protocol. They acted within their rights, and they did so to protect this community. A calculated pause. Then, the line she had been waiting to deliver. And yet, instead of facing accountability, Mr. Carter has chosen to paint himself as a victim. The words landed hard, hanging in the air. A ripple moved through the courtroom, shifts in seats, a murmur just barely contained. Barnes exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly, as if all of this was just a formality. Reynolds continued, "The prosecution will show that Officer Barnes and his partner had every reason to suspect Mr. Carter that night, that their actions were lawful, justified, and in the interest of public safety." Another pause. Another glance toward the jury, measured, rehearsed. Then, smoothly, she turned and took her seat. Barnes leaned in, whispered something to her, his smirk never fading. Ethan didn't move, didn't react. Instead, he slowly rose to his feet. A shift passed through the room, small but unmistakable. A ripple of curiosity. Defendants didn't defend themselves. Not in cases like these. Not against prosecutors like Reynolds. And yet, here he was. He adjusted his tie, deliberate, unhurried. He didn't rush to speak. He let the silence settle first. Let them wait. Let them wonder. Then finally, his voice cut through the air. Even, steady, carrying something heavier than just words. "There's something important we should all remember." He turned, his gaze moving from the jury to the gallery, then finally landing on Barnes. "A lie only works when everyone agrees to believe it." Silence. Barnes's smirk twitched. Just a fraction. Ethan let the weight of his words settle. He wasn't here to defend himself. He was here to expose them. "Now," he continued, stepping forward, his voice unshaken, unbreakable. "Let's talk about the truth." For a moment, the room stood still. The weight of expectation pressed against the walls, thick and unrelenting. Eyes shifted between Ethan and the prosecution, waiting, anticipating. Ethan let the silence stretch. Let them feel it. Then he stepped forward. "The prosecution says this case is about facts." His voice was calm, measured, each word placed with precision. "And I agree. So let's talk about the facts." He turned slightly, his gaze locking onto Reynolds, then flicking briefly toward Barnes. The man who had sat so comfortably before, now just a little too still. A small nod to Samantha. She moved efficiently, sliding a flash drive into the bailiff's hand. A moment later, the screen at the front of the room flickered to life. Black and white footage, a timestamp glowing in the corner, a grainy image of an ATM vestibule, a man standing at the machine withdrawing cash. His back turned, then turning, Ethan. The timestamp was exactly the same time the alleged burglary took place. A low murmur rippled through the courtroom, quiet but unmistakable. Ethan turned to the jury. "I wasn't at the crime scene," he said simply. "I wasn't even close." He let that settle, let them process it. Then he stepped back to the defense table, picking up another file. "There's more," he continued, voice steady. Barnes' posture shifted, just slightly, but enough. His fingers curled against the table's edge. His smirk, gone. Ethan held up a second flash drive. "This," he said, turning it in his fingers before handing it to the bailiff, "is audio from Officer Barnes's patrol car. Captured automatically the moment I was placed inside." A few beats of silence. Then a click. And Barnes's voice filled the courtroom. A low chuckle, easy, dripping with arrogance. "Man, this is almost too easy." A sharp inhale somewhere in the room. Someone in the gallery shifted forward. Static crackled. Then another voice, uneasy. Should we even be doing this? There's no real case here. Barnes cut in, his tone smooth, dismissive. Relax. No one's gonna question it. You think the court's gonna take his word over ours? Another chuckle. We'll make it stick, they always do. Then, silence. Not just on the recording, but in the courtroom itself. The jury sat frozen. Someone exhaled, sharp and slow. Reynolds' fingers tightened around her pen, her face a careful mask of neutrality. And Barnes, his jaw clenched, his hands curled into fists. Ethan took a single step closer, his voice never rising, never rushing. This, he said, gesturing toward the screen where the audio still lingered, is the man who arrested me. His eyes found Barnes. No anger, no theatrics, just cold, undeniable truth. Tell me, officer. Ethan let the words land before delivering the final blow. Do you still think no one's going to question it? The weight of silence bore down on the courtroom. Thick, unyielding. Everyone knew what had just happened. The truth had been dragged into the light, evidence laid bare, voices captured forever in the recording that now echoed in their minds. But Ethan wasn't finished. The defense calls Officer Lucas Grant to the stand. The room shifted, a ripple of movement. No one had expected this. For a moment, Grant didn't move. Then, slowly, too slowly, he rose from his seat. Barnes didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge him. Grant's steps were stiff as he approached the stand, his hands at his sides, but his fingers twitched. The bailiff swore him in. He sat. Ethan stepped forward, slow and deliberate. Officer Grant, Ethan said, voice even, unwavering. You were present the night of my arrest. Grant swallowed. Yes. You were in the patrol car. Another pause. Yes. Ethan let the silence stretch just long enough. Did you have probable cause to arrest me? Grant's throat bobbed, his fingers curled around the edge of the witness stand. From the prosecution table, Barnes sat rigid, his smirk long gone. Reynolds tapped her pen once, then set it down, the movement precise, controlled. We received a call about a suspect, Grant finally said. A suspect, Ethan repeated. His voice was calm, measured, but relentless. He stepped closer, not aggressive, not forceful, just steady, just undeniable. And I matched that description? A flicker. A shift in Grant's gaze, to the jury, to the gallery, to Reynolds. Searching, hoping for a way out. Ethan gave him none. Instead, he asked, Do you remember what I said to you that night? Grant's hands tightened on the wooden rail. He remembered. Ethan let the silence press in. Then, soft, quiet, but cutting through the air like a blade, he repeated it. You can stay silent now, but can you live with that for the rest of your life? Grant exhaled shaky, his jaw tensed, his fingers flexed, and then he broke. The tension snapped, not with an outburst, not with rage, but with a single trembling truth. Yes. His voice cracked. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting down, away from everyone. Yes, we made it up. A gasp rippled through the room. Someone whispered a curse under their breath. We didn't have a suspect, Grant admitted, voice barely above a whisper. Barnes told me we'd make it look legitimate, that no one would question it. A heavy beat of silence. Then Barnes moved. His chair scraped back as he bolted upright, his face twisted in fury. Grant, enough. The judge's gavel slammed down, sharp, final. But the damage was done. Grant sat there, shoulders slumped, the weight of truth finally crashing down on him. And in that moment, justice wasn't just an idea. It was happening. The courtroom sat in stunned silence. The gavel had struck, but its echo wasn't just in the wood. It was in the walls, in the heavy air, in the realization settling over everyone present. The truth had been spoken, and it could not be undone. Barnes stood rigid at the prosecution table, his hands gripping the edge so tightly his knuckles had gone white. His once confident smirk was gone, his arrogance replaced by something else entirely. Panic. He turned to Reynolds, his lips parting, but she didn't look at him. She was already packing her notes, already distancing herself from a man who had just lost everything. The judge cleared his throat, looking down at Barnes with the kind of measured disappointment that cuts deeper than rage. Officer Barnes, he said, his voice carrying through the room, steady, firm. You are hereby placed on immediate suspension, pending formal charges. A rustle of movement. The bailiffs, the very officers who once saw Barnes as one of their own, stepped forward. Barnes flinched. No, he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. No, this isn't how it. Stand down, officer. The bailiff's tone left no room for argument. Barnes' hands clenched into fists, his breath coming faster. but there was nowhere left to run. Slowly, for the first time in his career, not by choice, he raised his hands. The metal of the handcuffs clamped shut around his wrists, a sharp, definitive sound that seemed to mark the end of an era. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras clicked, capturing the moment, a symbol of power finally being held accountable. But this wasn't just about Barnes. Ethan knew it, and so did they. As the bailiffs led Barnes away, a new kind of energy filled the room. Not just shock, not just relief, but the unmistakable shift of something bigger beginning to crack open. Because Barnes had been protected, he had been enabled, and those who shielded him were still out there. The wheels of justice had started turning. But Ethan? Ethan was just getting started. The press conference was electric. Cameras flashed, microphones crowded together. The world was watching. Ethan stood at the podium, his posture strong, his expression unwavering. The weight of the case, of the fight, of everything he had just endured. It should have exhausted him, but instead, it fueled him. He scanned the sea of faces before him. Reporters, activists, citizens who had come not just to hear, but to witness. To see if justice would remain a fleeting moment, or if it would become something real. The murmurs quieted, the air stilled. Ethan leaned slightly forward, and then he spoke. "Justice," he said, his voice steady, carrying beyond the walls of the courthouse, beyond the cameras, beyond this moment. "Justice is not a privilege, it is a right." A pause. It does not belong to the powerful. It does not bend to influence. It is not reserved for the few, while the many are left behind. His hands gripped the sides of the podium, not out of frustration, but conviction. "And I will not stop," he continued, "until it belongs to everyone." For a moment, there was silence. Then, applause. A slow ripple at first, then rising, swelling, a wave of something undeniable. Hope, determination. A belief that maybe, just maybe, the fight wasn't over. That maybe this wasn't just about one man or one case, but something bigger. Ethan stepped back, letting the words settle, letting the weight of them carry. He turned. The courthouse steps stretched before him. The road ahead uncertain, the battle far from finished. But he walked forward anyway. Because justice didn't wait, and neither would he. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you why justice matters, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more powerful stories that shine a light on truth, justice, and the fight for what's right. Your support means everything. It fuels us to keep creating, to keep telling stories that matter. Together, we can make sure voices like Ethan's are never silenced. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.